Welcome, everybody. It's Margie Meacham, and we are back for another edition of the Learning to Go podcast. And as a reminder, we were recently voted in the top 10 podcasts in the world for learning and development professionals. So you've made a good choice to be with us today. And I'm really excited about our guest, Dr. Gage. He is a neuroscientist, and I'm sure many of you have heard of him, and he's the co-founder of Backyard Brains. And we're really going to learn a little bit more about that organization and his work today. So welcome, Doctor. Please tell me about yourself and your work.
Okay, I am a neuroscientist. Before I was a neuroscientist, I was an electrical engineer for many years. And so when I was in grad school studying to be a neuroscientist, I would often go with my lab mates into schools to kind of talk about the brain. We don't really teach the brain that well in K through 12. Until we talk about kind of what was the function of the brain and what are neurons, and what we found quickly was that it's hard to actually talk about brain function by using analogies. And so the stuff that I do as a neuroscientist and we were doing in our lab was kind of hands-on, understanding electrical action potentials, how they propagate, what do they actually encode, the information they encode. We could do that with analogies, but it wasn't really working out that well. It was, jump ropes and ping pong balls can be action potentials and neurotransmitters, but it's all, they could also be used for toys. And I never really felt that we were actually getting the message across that well. And so my lab mate, Tim, and I decided that we were going to change this. We set out with a self-imposed engineering challenge, and we called it the $100 spike. And the goal was we wanted to replace about $40,000 worth of lab equipment, which we use as neuroscientists, and make it affordable enough that teachers and students would be able to have a kit that will allow them to record a living neuron and do that in a setting that it can be done in the classroom. So we couldn't bring our rigs into the classroom, but we could maybe make something that we can do that. So we presented that as a poster for the Society of Neuroscientists, and we did that with just kind of like a bit of a hipster mentality, just trying to show off that we were able to do this. But it actually, what happened was a bit surprising, that the scientists that were there absolutely loved the idea, that they could bring their work into the world and show people what they actually do. And we got picked up by the journal Nature, which is one of the top scientific journals in the world, and we were on their podcast. And all of a sudden, I'm still doing my PhD and publishing what I thought were kind of high-profile journal articles. And I never once got an email from a colleague saying, "Hey, man, that fast spiking interneuron paper you did that talked about, decision making, I love that one. Keep up the good work." But this little side project that we were doing, I was getting like 4 or 5 emails a week saying, "Hey, man, that's really cool. I want to buy one of those kits." And slowly we realized that maybe the side project that we were starting should be the main project. And so we started a company called Backyard Brains in grad school that we were able to take that experiment that we did for a poster and make it into an actual product. And then we started to sell those products. And eventually we got funding from the National Institutes of Mental Health to actually help us to scale it up. And now we're in every state of the union and in about 62 states or countries around the world, which we're pretty excited about.
Yeah, that is exciting. That's fantastic. So what are a couple of things, let's say I buy a Backyard Brain kit. What are some of the things I can do with it?
Yeah, so there, it allows you. We always say it allows you to peer in to your soul, because we always talk about the brain is the center that has all of our memories, our emotions. But many people don't know. I should say majority of the man on the street don't actually understand that the brain actually functions through a network of cells that fire action potentials, and it's through those action potentials that all of these memories and senses come to life, right? So what our kits allow students and teachers to do is to record living neurons. So you're going to record these action potentials and understand how they encode information. And so you do that by, we have about a little bit north of about 50 experiments that we've done. We keep developing new experiments every couple months. And so you can peer in to see how, for example, the most simplest thing, which is rate coding. how do we encode information from our eyes and our ears and our touch receptors? That's done through a process in which a neuron will increase its firing rate. It doesn't increase the size of the action potentials or the spikes, but it increases the number of spikes per second. And so we do in experiments, we work with invertebrates, cockroaches and worms and crickets and grasshoppers. And these guys are invertebrates, so they don't have big bones and stuff like that. So you can just put a little pin right through the exoskeleton, and you'll be able to touch the metal will touch against the axons that run up the neuron, and through that you can see everything. You can see all the neural activity, and then if you, for example, if you brush with a stick on some of the hairs, you'll see the action potentials rates increase. And you plug it into your phone, and then you can actually record this data, and then you can start to analyze that and start to understand a bit about how the brain works. And this is important for us to do because we live in a world where we have 20% of the world has a neurological disorder, and we have no cures for those diseases. And so if we can get a tool out there that people can start to use to really understand at a quantitative level, this is not just a toy. This is a scientific instrument that can be used to publish papers. And so we think that's important so that we can start to train the next generation of scientists to be skeptical, to use data, to actually test hypotheses, and then more importantly, put those answers out there in the form of some type of a publication. And so that's really what we're about. And we're trying to create what we call the neural revolution, which is being able to have amateurs sort of contribute to the field the way that amateurs contribute to astronomy. The Hale-Bopp comet was discovered by them, and a lot of stuff in computer science and mathematics is done by amateurs, but not much in biology. So we're going to hopefully change that with these tools.
I think that is a really exciting idea, and I love the comparison to astronomy. It's one of my hobbies on the side. Yeah. And, I just love the little factoid that there's as many neurons in our brain as there are stars in the Milky Way. And probably sheer coincidence in the universe, but who knows? Maybe there's some reason for that. I am so fascinated by the fact that you started as an electrical engineer because the brain is so electrical, and I am seeing the term come up now, neurosciences in the plural, because you really need to converge many sciences in order to understand that. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't really heard that term, but I can guess what they're referring to, because the brain it's a difficult thing to study. I mean, number one, it's buried in a skull, which is hard to get access to. You have to literally use a drill that you'd find in a garage to make a burr hole. It has to be alive, and so like many other structures from the body that you can actually take apart and understand how they work just by looking at them, are mechanicals, like muscles, bones, hearts, lungs, and so the brain tissue needs to be alive, and so with these constraints, the Brain Initiative has been out there trying to understand a way that we can, what's called non-invasively, so without drilling these holes into the brain, record from these data, right? So there's a whole bunch of new techniques coming out in imaging. There's a lot of genetic techniques that are coming out that use optogenetics, for example, using light to turn on and off neurons and watch the behaviors. Even in electrophysiology, my field, that's changing so quickly because of the ability. I mean, we'd use one channel when we recorded, or maybe two channels when we use our spiker box. But professional neuroscientists, they want to know, how does the microcircuitry of the brain work? And so there is a huge science field within electrophysiology to sort of grow that number into 1,000 electrodes, recording simultaneously to understand how a small micro network of neurons can compute something that turns into a behavior towards the end. So convergence from physics, and also in chemistry, in neurochemistry as well. So there's a lot of converging science, and that's why when you go to Society for Neuroscience, which is the kind of the gathering of all the neuroscientists in the world, there's about 40,000 of us that join together every fall, right around. So I'm going to go in 2 weeks in Washington, D.C. And if you just look through the guide is so big that they split it into 4 thick, heavy books of all the sciences that are going on at that time. But they range the gamut everywhere from, psychology, which is completely, I haven't even mentioned that yet, all the way down to sort of the animal studies, which really are the workhorses for how we understand how the brain works. And then within that, you got all these different fields that are there, from engineers and physicists that are working on imaging techniques to the biologists that are working on genetic techniques. And so with CRISPR, Cas9, with channel rhodopsin and all these things that are happening in the genetic field, we're now having some tools to really understand how this brain works. And I still think it's going to be a long time before we get to that answer. Not probably in my lifetime. I'm not one of these people that think that there's going to be an AI revolution sometime soon because of the knowledge we have from the brain. I don't think we have that knowledge yet. I don't think we will. We don't have a Moore's law in neuroscience. We don't have exponential growth of knowledge, unfortunately. But we are growing. We're understanding it. But anyway, so there are many fields that contribute to neuroscience, and that's why it's exciting. I think if you talk about STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, there's not many fields that really bring all those together quite like neuroscience. And so that's what excites me as an engineer and as a neuroscientist, because the brain is electrical, and so you need, I think personally, the best neuroscientists out there are physicists and electrical engineers. So just by looking at, I guess naming Yuri Bezaki, even Hoskin Huxley, all the famous neuroscientists, engineering pairs that have gone on and made Nobel Prize winning discoveries have had kind of a mixed past, right? So they'll have some type of a engineering past. So the brain's a hard area to sort of study, and so having these people on there to look at is helpful.
Yeah, that's interesting that you. I have noticed that it takes more than one discipline to understand it. Of course, I'm one of those amateurs that tries to work with this information, and I think partly this sheer complexity is very intimidating to the people who are listening to us right now. That's the learning professional.
This is why we came up with our kit. So so when we do an experiment, we take it from, for example, a science paper in the AAAS journal Science, or a Nature paper, something that was a big discovery, and then we strip away all the complexity from it. Because, like, for example, like we use in science, we use big rigs, and they have lots of steam dials on there to sort of adjust the frequencies and the gains to be able to record a particular signal. And so we sell a series of kits, and each one of those is aimed at a particular type of experiment. And so if you want to record from a neuron, you just have one switch; it just turns it on and off. But once it's been set, we kind of pre-coded it to be able to record from a neuron. You're then able to do the experiments that the scientist was doing with that $40,000 piece of equipment. So that means we can sort of replicate first, just to be able to prove to ourselves and prove to and have a student prove to themselves that they're able to record the nervous system, understand the nervous system by setting event markers so that we know at the timing that something happened, we know the number of spikes that occurred, for example. And then what we can do is have them answer questions that we don't know the answers to, which is really where science gets exciting, right? It's one thing to kind of do an experiment that's step by step, and no one likes doing that, including most kids that I know. Because that's just kind of like, grunt work, right? But if you pose a question that literally we don't know the answer to, it'd be interesting to see how they can come up with experiments that will be able to sort of tease that answer out. So, for example, I just gave a TED talk, went up 2 weeks ago, on plant electrophysiology, and that is interesting. The Venus flytrap, we know, fires action potentials but the mechanism at which it does that is still not understood. And so there's probably a Nobel Prize waiting somewhere within there, but that's kind of low-hanging fruit. So these are plants people can buy. We have the recording equipment that people can record these extra potentials, and maybe come up with some clever ways to sort of tease apart what's actually happening inside the plant to figure out how does it know to close within this 20-second window. So it's interesting just to see you don't have to scratch the surface too deep to find questions that we don't know the answers to.
I saw that TED Talk, and in fact, that's what inspired me to reach out to you because, gee, this guy, he is just doing such fun stuff. And you talk about STEM, and it's a great concern of mine that right now it seems like in certain corners it's kind of fashionable to deny science. People think it's okay to throw out the scientific method and just, hey, my opinion is just as good as something that was peer reviewed and went through the rigorous process of science. And kids aren't necessarily even aspiring to be scientists anymore.
Right. And I think it's I mean, we as a community are slowly trying to address that. Yeah, we live in a post-fact era, and so how do we combat against that? Is to change the way that science is taught, and that's kind of what the NGSS is all about. So it's kind of moving away from facts and trying to like measure knowledge based upon what they can recite back, and more about focusing on how do you think like a scientist. And so this like if you notice in the standards, they're all about kind of a guiding question. And so now this is interesting. So now it's a question and not an answer, right? That we're teaching. And so and the students find the answers themselves, and then they have to learn how to basically collect the data and then be critical of their own data, and then make arguments and support their arguments with the data. I think if students were trained this way, 20 years ago, I don't think we would have quite what we have right now, where people are just so easily taking in fake news and not criticizing that, and like not being able to discern what's real and not real because they're not asking the fundamental questions, And so I think teaching to think like a scientist is more important than actually knowing the actual science. Is my takeaway. And so this all these project-based learning paradigms that are coming out, which have a driving question that allows students to sort of dig this up and be able to defend that. And I think the more we teach this, I think the better off we'll be as a society.
So, and I agree with you on that. And here's a challenge we have as educators and trainers, as the adults. There's products out there, a lot of them, because neuroscience is hot, which is a good thing. But there are people out there peddling things that aren't necessarily grounded in science. For example, there's a big difference between a backyard brain kit and some of these headsets that are purporting,
awesome. And I think that's on us right now to educate the world. I think there's so much money being made because of a lack of understanding about how the brain works, even basic understanding. So if you knew, for example, what the electroencephalogram was, the EEG, which is what these Muse and all these headsets that people put on their heads to control things, if you actually understood how that signal worked, you wouldn't believe that and you wouldn't buy that. But there is a basic misunderstanding about how the EEG signal arises, and I think with that, there's a lot of people who are going to be selling things, and we always joke that if any of these kits actually worked, we would all be wearing them. The fact that we don't means they probably don't work, right? It would be so much easier if I could just think about something, sending an email, and then actually sending an email, or even controlling my light switch. It'd be easier just to think about controlling my. But the thing is, these things don't really work. The control aspects that people want to have, be able to control a drone or control is not quite how it works. It does work. I'm not saying it doesn't. The EEG signal is real. It's just detecting, there's millions and millions of neurons all doing the same thing. And when you're all doing the same thing, you don't have much fine control. And so you can, not learn to control your attention, so you kind of zone out, and when you zone out, you get a rhythm in your EEG signal, and then you can then use that to control. know that. And so they think, oh, I can control something with my brain. I want that. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's tough. So what we just got another round of funding from the National Institute of Mental Health again to build a full curriculum for 1 year to be able to teach a neuroscience course in K through 12. So we're going to base it around the AP biology framework. And hopefully, you know, if we have this discussion in 5 or 6 years, students will be a lot more skeptical and more be able to sort of discern what's real and what's not.
Yeah. You know what? I will be happy to have you back to talk about that. When you get that curriculum ready, let's do that. I would love to. That'd be fantastic. And I suggest that a lot of the adults take that curriculum as well, because I think that that's the only way we're going to bridge the gap. Is kind of send some of us back to school at the same time that we're teaching the next generation.
Yeah, so this is and we actually have a number of curriculum that's out there right now. What we're trying to do now is kind of put it together into a textbook so that we can kind of, you know, package it with the kind of the history of why we're doing certain things, really focusing on figuring out how to think like a scientist. What like, you know, controls, that's an important aspect, which is not really taught that well from what I can tell. So we have that right now, but we're trying to sort of expand that into something that it's a little bit easier for a teacher to be able to take and make it into a semester-long course. So
okay.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that when we do that.
Yeah, so. Fantastic. All right, so I was about to ask you, what are you working on right now that has you most excited? Would that be it?
It's so funny because we work on so many different. This is what I love about being a scientist, and especially a scientist that's not attached to a university. I am a research scientist. I publish papers every year, and we do research, but we kind of eat our own dog food. So we claim that students should be able to publish peer-reviewed journal articles using our gear. And so to show that that's real, we publish a number of journal articles a year based upon our stuff. And so that allows us the flexibility to do whatever we want to do. And so we have, let's see, last summer we worked with dragonflies. And so we're trying to understand, how do dragonflies capture prey at a 98% success rate? So if you look at the animal kingdom, like lions, which you think are ferocious killers and they're awesome, they're only at 50%. You know, sharks are less than that. And so the actual killer of the kingdom is the dragonfly. But how is it able to do it at a 98% success rate when it sees another fly is going to eat it? Turns out that the neurons in the brain are highly tuned to make that, to basically allow that dragonfly to focus and fixate. So fixate means when the fly moves, his wings move, almost like they're connected together by a string. And it's a brain that's doing all that computation that sends that neuron, sends it back down to the wing, controls the wings. And so one of the projects we were working on now is being able to push a small little wire just right on the neck of the dragonfly, and then we can control the fly and really understand, because we can watch that neuron as it sends its command down to the wing and try to tease apart what it is that the brain is actually doing to allow that dragonfly to catch her. So we work with that. We're working with electric fish. We can do electroencephalograms, the EEGs, the things that the headsets that I just said don't work. They actually, and what's funny is that they don't actually allow you, for the most part, to actually record the EEG data, the important stuff. They do these kind of gimmicky games around it. But we actually use the low-level EEG data to show you what's going on. So we did a cool project this summer where we had people do a memory task, you know, kind of like that's the game with the cards when you were a kid. You flip them over, you had to remember where they were. And then we would do is have the person fall asleep. And during sleep, we could play back some of the cues of, if, for example, if the card was a baby crying, or you would have a sound of a baby crying, right? And then if the sound was a car, you'd have a sound of a car horn or something like that. And so we had sounds associated with each one of these games that they were playing. It was on an iPad. And then when they fell asleep, we would play those sounds during slow wave sleep, only 50% of them, and the other 50% were control. And when they wake back up, we'd have them play the game again. And sure enough, the people that the cues that we actually played during their sleep, during slow wave sleep, they actually did better at remembering than the other ones. This is called targeted memory reactivation. And it's a pretty interesting phenomenon. And so we do EEG stuff. We do stuff with plants, electrical recordings from plants, Venus flytraps, mimosas, and we have a new plant called the dancing plant we're trying to do some experiments on now. We work with electric fish. With songbirds, we're trying to understand how songbird communication happens between species and within species. We're trying to identify songbirds so we can actually look at more global patterns of migration of birds. We work with weakly electric fish to understand fish have action potentials that travel through the water sometimes. This is how they see the world and communicate with other species of fish. And so we have, just tons of projects from EKGs, which is the heart cardio stuff. We've been working on new experiments that look at the autonomic nervous system so the pain, fight or flight response by sticking your hand in ice water. You can measure some really cool responses from your EKGs. So anyway, they're all grounded in activities that a student can do in a setting that really sort of ties back to some huge important concept within neuroscience, and we do that in a rigorous way that we think that only scientists that have been trained in the field that can do that can help sort of explain, working with teachers to sort of explain this to students. And so anyway, lots of cool stuff. You can check out our website. We've given 4 TED Talks on the main stage, and we've have a number of kind of shows on Netflix and YouTube coming out next month. And we just actually finished a new series of shows that will be airing next year that are going to focus on a number of the projects that we did this last summer.
Okay, thanks. And we will have a list of all of those links, including, of course, Backyard Brains and how you can get started there in the write-up on our site that goes with this podcast. So please check those out. And I want to thank my guest again. My guest has been Dr. Greg Gage, the co-founder and neuroscientist. He's co-founder of Backyard Brains, and he's recruiting the next generation of amateur scientists. So feel free to jump in and join him. Thank you so much, Doctor, for your time today and for all the information and all the work that you're doing.
All right. Thank you for having me on. Cheers.